last week we were getting ready to say goodbye to the furlough scheme, and then on the evening of Saturday the 31st of October, just a few hours before the scheme was supposed to come to an end and the job support scheme was due to start, the Prime Minister announced that the furlough scheme was being extended and the job support scheme postponed. Then, yesterday in Parliament, the Chancellor announced a further extension to the furlough scheme and postponement of the job support scheme until the end of March. So what that means for the job support scheme beyond March is anybody's guess at this stage, but for now we know that furlough is here to stay until the end of March. So I thought it would be worth doing a refresher of the main terms and conditions around the furlough scheme and some things that employers need to be aware of at this stage, whether they've had furloughed employees or not, because the slate's wiped clean. We've got a clean start from the 1st of November. Anybody who has used the furlough scheme before or hasn't used the furlough scheme before is entitled to make use of the scheme from the 1st of November. Equally, if an employer has used the furlough scheme before for certain employees and not others, well, those others that haven't been furloughed before can now be furloughed from the 1st of November. One thing that employers are going to have to watch is in relation to the calculations. Slightly different for someone who has been on furlough before as opposed to someone who's being furloughed for the first time. So if someone's been furloughed before, then the calculation remains as it has done throughout the scheme. That's 80% of pay with the cap based on what it was in March 2020. In short, someone who hasn't been furloughed yet, the relevant pay period is what they were paid in October 2020. So if you've got two employees on the minimum wage, one who's been furloughed since March and one who's new to the business and hasn't been furloughed yet, then one of the earlier employee who's been furloughed will get 80% of what the minimum wage was back in March, and the employee who's furloughed now for the first time will get the benefit of 80% of what the new minimum wage is after the increase in April. So that's just something to watch if you are involved in payroll, making sure that the 80% is calculated correctly based on the correct pay reference period. It's important just to say as well, just by way of reminder to those who have used the scheme before and just by way of information for people who haven't used the scheme, the overarching purpose of the scheme is that if your operations are adversely affected by coronavirus, you can use the scheme. And that's quite wide in what it means. It's not saying necessarily that you have to demonstrate as the employer that you can't afford to keep employees on their full contracted hours. There are circumstances where it's appropriate to furlough employees, and there's circumstances set out in the guidance where it's not. So the circumstances that provide for furloughing may be related to the specific employee. If an employee is on long-term sick leave or shielding, particularly because they've got a vulnerability to coronavirus and they have medical advice to that effect, then that can be good grounds to furlough them, even though operationally otherwise the business wouldn't have a need to. But there are certain circumstances where it's not okay to use furlough, and one of those would be for a short-term period of sickness or isolation. So if an employee is otherwise fully working but then has to self-isolate for 2 weeks because they get contacted by track and trace, for instance, then you can't put them on furlough just to cover that period of isolation. That would be deemed to be a period where they would be entitled to statutory sick pay but not be entitled to be furloughed. Equally, in relation to annual leave, if an employee is flexibly furloughed, and by that we mean they're working part of their hours but not their full working hours, if that's happening anyway and they take a period of annual leave, then the period of annual leave can be treated as a period of furlough. The employer can claim the grant through the scheme and top up to 100% of pay. But if an employee isn't otherwise furloughed, then they can't be furloughed just for the purposes of taking a period of annual leave. So it's important to be clear on the circumstances in which furlough can be claimed and the circumstances in which it can't. It's also important to have an agreement recorded with the employee. If that's someone that you haven't had furloughed before, then that'll be a full furlough agreement setting out the terms and making sure that they're committing not to work during furloughed hours and setting out what their pay will be. If someone has been furloughed before and you want to extend that due to the extension to the scheme, then that's a straightforward letter explaining that the scheme has been extended and asking them to continue to consent to having their wages supported through the scheme and the deduction in pay if indeed you're doing a deduction in pay, because the scheme does allow employers to top up pay to full pay if they wish and can afford to do so. One other thing just to note is that the job retention bonus, which was intended to be paid out to employers for every furloughed employee who remained on their books until the 31st of January, that has now been postponed or deferred, and all that we know about that is that the government have said that that will be redeployed and there will be a retention incentive put in place at an appropriate time when the scheme comes to an end. So anyone who was thinking that they were getting £1,000 per employee who's still with them at the end of January may be a little disappointed to hear that, but hopefully that is still coming in some form after the end of March when the scheme ends. So as ever, if anyone has any particular queries about the scheme or how it can be used or what it can be used for, then don't hesitate to get in touch.